Hello, friends, and welcome to the Confusing and Ambiguous podcast, uh, talking about music. Today, I want to talk about some things that were happening in a parallel universe simultaneously to all the pop music that we obsess over on our music podcasts and music discussions. You hear about so much from 1967, what was going on in 1967. So many great albums and bands were happening in 1967. Some bands that were created earlier hit these crazy peaks in 1967. You know, you had, I'm not even going to go through all the albums. Google 1967 music charts, what records were released, and you'll just go through this huge list of incredible stuff. You'll go, I love that, I love that, I love that, I love that. But there was also some other things going on in 1967 that don't get talked about in the pop music realms as much. Because I think at the time they might have been considered sort of uncool Squaresville man, like L7, and they weren't they weren't received by the counterculture as being cool or whatever. And I think maybe the grown-ups were listening to it. But, enough time has passed, and I myself have become recently a grown up. I think I'm trying, maybe, I don't know. But anyway, grown up music in those days, there was, Frank Sinatra was still making records. I guess that's grown up music, but it was happening sort of parallel, simultaneously to the big stuff that was happening in '67 musically, around '67, '68, '69, those years. And then, 1969, you had your Woodstock thing that kind of blew up and exploded. And then Charles Manson came in and all this stuff happened. And it sort of became the 70s in 1969. It became the 70s before 1970. And the world sort of went a little bit darker and music went into another place. But before that happened, before that strange decade transformation happened and music went from being 60s music to being 70s music, which I love 70s music, but there was something that happened that changed everything from the groovy 60s to the kind of gritty 70s. And before that happened, there were some amazing things that were happening parallel to the popular music. One of those things was Burt Bacharach. I know Burt Bacharach, yeah, I know. But the music is incredible. This album is called Reach Out, and it has some of the great ones on here. It's got Alfie, Bond Street, The Look of Love, and Windows of the World, A Message to Michael. What the world needs now is love. Are you there with another girl? So many great songs on here, and this is actually a Burt Bacharach album, so it's not Dionne Warwick singing. It's that incredible kind of easy listening pop music that the songwriting is so sophisticated, and I mean the musicality is sophisticated, but the subject matter and the delivery of this music is sophisticated. This is like you put it on your turntable and you have your cocktail party. It just takes you to a place. It takes you to a mood. It gives you that feeling of the other side of the '60s, where the cocktail parties were happening, and but in addition to that, I mean, it's got some of that nostalgia vibe to it, and some people kind of go, "Oh, that's cool, Burt Bacharach." But Burt Bacharach, who we sadly lost fairly recently, wrote some absolutely incredible music. Really great. I kind of put him up there with someone like Ennio Morricone, where he was able to take, traditional instrumentation. It's not really guitars, drums, and bass group, pop group. He is mostly keyboards, his piano, and some other kind of orchestral instrumentation. But like Ennio Morricone, Burt Bacharach had this way of taking things that sound simple. There are no like single note riffs in Burt Bacharach's music and Ennio Morricone's, where he's somehow able to take a single note phrase and it just tears you up. It breaks your heart, or it gives you a feeling, and sometimes it comes off as being so simple. You're like, that sounds like children's music almost, where it's like dun 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 dun, and you have that sound, that simple tune. But when you put it in the context of his songs and the words and the production, the way it sounds, it works so beautifully. And I just absolutely love Burt Bacharach's music. I love almost all of his albums. He, in later years did some records with other people where he was using the sort of the pop instrumentation, like he did the things with Elvis Costello, which I highly recommend, and some other creative types that he collaborated with. But in these days, he was collaborating with a guy named Hal David, who was his lyricist. Burt wrote the music and Hal wrote the words, and the words are so important to this. They're so integral to the sound of this music. This, again, I want to use the word sophisticated, because I think Burt Bacharach's music absolutely represents sophistication in a good way, not in a kind of exclusive or exclusive way. It's happy music. It's good, solid music. Love Burt Bacharach. And around this time, this Burt Bacharach album came out in 1967. Like I was saying, check out what else came out in 1967, and then consider how outrageous this would have been if you'd put it on your turntable along with your psychedelic pop records and whatnot. But I think some people appreciated him back then who were into pop music, rock music. You can't deny it. You can't deny that these are great songs. I'm sorry, you can't. They're great songs. But someone else who was in a group that was kind of drums, bass, and guitar, pop music, there was a band called the Walker Brothers in the 60s that did those kind of sophisticated but still poppy kind of songs. It's hard to explain. They kind of were in, like, on the razor's edge between things like Paul Revere and the Raiders or something, or those kind of bands, like maybe the Zombies or something, and Frank Sinatra, or the kind of crooner singers, because their singer Scott Walker, whose real name is Scott Engel. I think the Walker Brothers were doing kind of a Ramones thing where they all took on the last name Walker, but Scott Walker, real name Scott Engel, kept the name Scott Walker through his career. And in the Walker Brothers, they did some songs with arrangements with like orchestral instruments, small orchestral instrument arrangements, and they did some sort of classic sounding singer torchy kind of songs. But then after the Walker Brothers, Scott Walker went on and did some solo albums that I think are among the most incredible, moving, moody, kind of, in a way, proto-goth, I would say, in some ways. They're unlike the Sinatra albums, even though they have the same kind of score, like the string section and the scored underneath the pop singing, you'd have this string section doing this beautiful, background. They have that, but Scott Walker's solo albums, he kind of went into and did some Jacques Brel songs. He did some covers on some of the early albums, but then he started doing his own music and his own lyrics, and they were all very kind of dark, in some ways kind of twisted, kind of unexpected for the sound. When you hear the music, you hear his baritone voice delivering these songs in a very smoky nightclub in Paris. You get the impression that he's sitting on on a bench on a dirty burlesque stage, and there's a single, spotlight on him, and he's crooning these songs in this resonant voice of his. But then you hear the lyrics, and they kind of go into these strange territories about the street life and whatnot, and these sad loss, loss of youth and the loss of love, and all these sort of bittersweet, melancholy things that the kind of things Jacques Brel sang about. Scott Walker was an American who was in a British band, the Walker Brothers, so he had a kind of international vibe to him, and I think he was really into the idea of that guy sitting on the stage with his microphone, with the spotlight on him. And his albums are all great. There's Scott 1, Scott 2, 3, on up, and then he did an album called The Moviegoer, where he covered songs that were in movies. He did Climate of the Hunter. And they got, this is Scott 3. This one's got some incredible songs on it, like It's Raining Today, and Big Louise, and 30th Century Man, Two Ragged Soldiers, Funeral Tango. Great album, and all of his albums are great. All of his solo albums, the sort of numerical Scott albums, are incredible. And he went on to continue until, sadly, he passed away not too long ago, and a few years back. And his later music became more and more avant-garde. He was experimenting in some very interesting ways on his later albums. There's one called The Drift that's kind of hard to listen to, and some of his other albums are very minimal, and like his voice is sort of this sad cry from beyond. But still pretty great stuff. And I love that he experimented. He continued to push the envelope and do new and different things. But I very much recommend his first few solo albums after the Walker Brothers, his Scott albums. Anyway, they're great to put on if you want to have some friends over and have them say, "What is this? This is so cool." Because a lot of people don't know about Scott Walker, unfortunately. He was kind of overshadowed by a lot of the other things that were happening around that time. I mean, he was putting out these singer with string section orchestration albums. That album was 1969, and then there's a few before it that, a couple before it, and during a time when it was all about drums and guitars and bass guitars and drums and that kind of psychedelic kind of music, kind of pop music, radio pop music. He didn't seem to care about that. Didn't seem to care about what was going up the hit charts at the time. And I definitely recommend Scott Walker. If you want to go into another place that was happening simultaneously to what we consider to be the 60s. Anyway, thanks for joining me today, and thanks for making it this far. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing or ambiguous. Thank you. I'll talk to you again soon. Take care.